Hello, everyone. Today we're going to go to part 3 of our series, Paul in John's Revelation. And we're going to ask here a discrete question first. Why does Jesus condemn eating meat sacrificed to idols in his address to the churches in Asia? It's not something we're familiar with, so let's explore that, understand it, and let's begin. First of all, just to remind everybody, Asia is the churches he's addressing where he mentions this in chapter 2 of Revelation. Asia isn't in China or near Vietnam or anything like that. It's actually in Europe, near Greece, and now it's part of Turkey. And the city which was the capital was Ephesus, and about 250,000 people lived in the province of Asia. And you can see right next door is Galatia. Okay, and we're going to address, look at Jesus' addressing of the Nicolaitans doctrine at Ephesus, which Jesus says he hates. So Jesus says, but this you have in your favor, he's meaning that you hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Strong words from Jesus, right? So what were they teaching? The Nicolaitans, Jesus notes to the church at Pergamum that they taught a Christian, quote, eat things sacrificed to idols. And he refers to it as some holding the teaching of the Nicolaitans in like manner. So these Nicolaitans had also influenced Pergamum. Now, was this something new that the church didn't focus on previously? And no, it was a very strong emphasis in the church, particularly in dealing with Gentiles. And we'll see why God's law is so important in this regard. Acts 15:20. So this is James writing the decision of the group of what they would put on the Gentiles as an absolute minimum, meaning they have to do this at all times at the beginning of their walk, and they're going to go to Sabbath each week and learn more of the law. That's the whole ruling if you read it. But here's the ruling they gave about this. But that we write unto them that they abstain, that means don't eat, from the pollution of idols and from what is strangled, it's food. You're not under the law, you don't eat strangled animals, and from blood. You don't eat food with blood in it. You press it out. Acts 15:29, that you abstain from things sacrificed to idols. Again, that means don't eat them, which if you keep yourselves, it shall be well with you. Acts 21:25, James is repeating this to Paul directly, trying to remind him what are the rules. But as touching the Gentiles that have believed, we wrote, giving judgment that they should keep themselves from things sacrificed to idols, and from eating meat with blood, and from eating what is strangled. So this is the food requirements. So there you go. It was a very important rule. Some of them are clean and unclean rules, but eating idol meat is not in the clean, unclean law. And we'll see where it comes from. Okay, so let's look at the two passages where Jesus uses that word, eating things sacrificed to idols specifically. He's talking to the church at Pergamum, and he says, some among you hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block, the word is scandalon, before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols. So that's a stumbling block, a scandalon. Keep that in mind. Revelation 2:20, but I have this against you. This is a different church. I think it's Thyatira. That you suffer the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and seduces my servants to eat things sacrificed to idols. So this is clearly prohibited by Jesus. There's no wiggle room. You can't say he's making exceptions, or, he's saying you don't eat this meat, and you'll see why. So let's ask this question. When Jesus called it a scandalon to eat meat sacrificed to idols in Revelation 2:14, did he mean that was putting you at risk of your salvation? So here's Jesus in 13:41 using the same word. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all that cause stumbling or scandalon, and them that do iniquity, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire. So that's his word for saying someone is heading towards hell, absent of repentance and coming back and obeying God. So it's a very serious offense to do this in Jesus' mind, Jesus' instructions to us. So how serious a crime was eating meat sacrificed to idols in the world that Jesus was teaching, and the apostles are the 12 apostles are living in, and trying to make sure the Gentiles understand this is something you never do? Well, we learn a strong lesson from Daniel the prophet, because he is going to be a great example of not eating meat sacrificed to idols in the Bible. Okay, And there was an article done by Susan Weingarten, formerly of the Department of Classical Archaeology at Tel Aviv University, and she had an interesting quote here. So we're talking about, she's basically saying in the 200, 300 AD, BC period at least, there was a strong view on this. And it says here, this author, Ephron J. Ephron, quote, Gentile food had become suspect of being connected to pagan ritual, so it was considered preferable to suffer martyrdom rather than eat it. I mean, so you would rather die than being given idol meat to eat because of something God's told you this meat will defile you. So you'd rather die. Let's watch a prophet in action, putting this principle into effect, and I'll show you where he's getting this from the law. So basically, there's a law we'll see from in the Mosaic Law that basically you want to get rid of all these temples and everything, because you might actually sit down and eat with someone, and you know they have food that's been sacrificed to idol if you let these temples exist in your community. So the Jews' way of dealing with this is they follow God's command, and they didn't allow any temples to pagan gods. So they tried to, not 100%. And so that's how they kept people from eating meat sacrificed to idols. But what if you're like Daniel? You've been kidnapped basically to live in the king's palace in Babylon. So what do? The king allotted daily rations to them, the Jewish captives, from the king's food and from the wine he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's service. Among them were the Judahites. That's interesting. From the tribe of Judah, I guess, is Daniel. I didn't know that before I read this verse today. Daniel, now this is from the Israel Bible. I like sometimes to do it when we're looking at the Old Covenant works. Daniel, Chananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I don't know that language there. 7. The chief officer gave them new names. He named Daniel Belteshazzar, Chananiah, Shadrach, Mishael is Meshach, and Azariah is Abednego. I think we've all heard that in our songs when we were kids. So here is the example that was given in the Bible of someone who resisted eating meat sacrificed to idols. Now, you could read this and you might not know that's what he's doing, so I'll let you see how the scholars and Jewish people would have understood it. But the key word is defile there, and this is from the Israel Bible. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank. So basically he's saying both, actually, the drink and the food. That's important. So he sought permission of the chief officer not to defile himself. So he's explaining to the chief officer, I can't eat this food. It's going to defile me. So this has moral components. It's not clean, unclean. This is never. This is one of those never, ever, ever eating foods. And Kyle and Delich in their biblical commentary on this verse in Daniel comments as follows. And so this is how they know it's involving the command against eating meat sacrificed to idols. The partaking of the food brought to them, the 4 guys, from the king's table was to them contaminating, because forbidden by law, not so much because the food was not prepared according to the Levitical ordinance, or perhaps consisted of the flesh of animals which to the Israelites were unclean. This is not an clean law issue, for in this case the Jews were not under the necessity of refraining from the wine. See, why are they refraining from the wine at the same time they're refraining from the meat? So that's how he knows. He says, but the reason of their rejection of it was that the heathen at their feasts offered up in sacrifice to their gods a part of the food and the drink, and thus consecrated their meals by a religious rite, whereby he who participated in such a meal participated in the worship of idols. So even if you didn't mean to, these are foods that people have dedicated to worshiping idols. You don't do it. You don't participate, even if it looks like you're in a social gathering. Other commentators agree. This is why he didn't want to eat the food from the king's table. He, Daniel, was cautious from the first, Ellicott says. He feared that he might eat something that had been consecrated to idols. McLaren, he was determined in his brave young heart not to defile himself with the king's meal. So, hey, he could have had free meals all the time, but now he ends up having to like dig up pulses and lentils and eat all these vegetables. That's what ended up happening. The phrase points to the pollution incurred by eating things offered to idols. And I want you to see what Alexander McLaren says. He was a pastor for like decades, and in Manchester, England, and I think this tells you how the early church and Jesus were expecting Christians to behave just like Daniel. Daniel was determined in his brave young heart not to defile himself with the king's meat. The phrase points to the pollution incurred by eating things offered to idols. The great lesson from the incident is that religion should regulate the smallest details of life, and that it is not narrow over scrupulousness, but fidelity to the highest duty. When a man sets his foot down about any small matter and says, "No, I dare not do it, little as it is and pleasant as it might be to the senses, because I should thereby be mixed up in a practical denial of my God. So did not I, because of the fear of God." Nehemiah 5:15. So he is saying, again, this is a complete moral decision. God's told you this is immoral, illegal. Do not ever do this. Okay, well, where does this come from? It at least comes from Exodus 34, verses 12 to 15. There are other passages you can figure out the same idea, but this one's telling you to not even let the temples exist, because you might go to somebody's house, they'll hand you food, and you're not aware that it's idol meat. So here's how it goes. Exodus 34, verse 12. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land wherever you go, lest it be a snare in the midst of thee. By the way, snare is the same as the scandalon in Greek. But you shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars, and you shall cut down their asherim. These are these worship poles. For you shall worship no other God. For Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot after their gods, and sacrifice unto their gods, and won't call you, and you eat of his sacrifice. So you'll get an invitation to go to dinner. You sit down, you're eating, and you don't realize it, but it's meat sacrificed to idols. This is how defiling it is. That it's not that you're consciously aware of it. You're just eating it, and the only way to avoid this is not to have these temples. So what do you do if you're in a Gentile land? You do exactly what Daniel does. He just won't eat their food. When he goes to their meals, he eats only what he knows, where he knows it came from. Okay, and we're going to pick up on this slide you've seen before, and I'm going to discuss with you who are the Nicolaitans. We're going to get a picture of them. More will come later, but I wanted to cover it. So remember, Jesus says he hates the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. And you learn from Revelation 21:2, verses 14 to 15, that this doctrine at Pergamum, that they could eat meat sacrificed to idols, was discussed, and it said some holding the teaching of Nicolaitans in like manner. So this was a doctrine of the Nicolaitans as well. They taught eating meat sacrificed to idols, and that's what the Ephesian church rejected. At the same time, they rejected the false apostles. Okay, and now we're going to look at who Jesus was talking about when he was talking about the Nicolaitans. Robertson's a famous Robertson word pictures. I hope some of you have run into him before, but he's very knowledgeable about Greek. He'll kind of give you some background on Greek in the passage, and that will help explain things. And he's trying to do that here in this word pictures on Revelation 2:14. So I just want to give a background again. I think he was a Baptist preacher for decades, biblical scholar, of course, the word pictures books. In word pictures, he confesses the Nicolaitans defended eating such meat based on Paul's gospel of grace. This is how he puts it. These early Gnostics, and they're not Gnostic, but we'll let that go for the moment, practiced licentiousness since they were not under law, but under grace. So he's clearly identifying who is the source of their doctrine by putting it that bluntly. But I doubt these were Gnostics. And you have to remember, Paul talks about having a mystery. And the mystery is if you just have faith, you're saved. Okay, that's his mystery. And Gnostics were, we don't really have many of their writings, but the idea was they were teaching mysteries would save you. There's something secret they had, and knowledge could save you. Gnosis means knowledge. So, but Jesus is not being mysterious here. He is identifying a group that, as Archibald Robertson said, is a group that believes they're not under the law but under grace. There can only be one source of that doctrine for them. Okay, and we're ready to take off. But before we do, I want you to see where we're going. So this is, I always love showing people that, when they say, maybe you're misconstruing something, or, maybe you're looking at things too dark. This is as mainstream a book as you can find, and many scholars go along, but this is just, Kenneth Loy is writing a book called My Body, His Temple, The Prophet Daniel's Guide to Nutrition, okay? And he's looking at these passages. He knows what they say, and I haven't told you yet what they say in Paul, but I want you to hear it from somebody who doesn't think there's anything wrong with what Paul is teaching. So listen to this. This is his book at page 69. Idol meat is clean. Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 8. God had forbidden idol meat originally. Notice that, by the way. It's God does something originally, but something's going to change. Originally because it caused the children of Israel to go whoring after the gods of other nations. Exodus 34:15-16. I gave that to you earlier. Since the Gentiles were now equal in the sight of God, this restriction was no longer necessary. I find that puzzling. It's like, now that we're equal with Jews, supposedly under Paul's doctrines, this allows us to be free of the law that we're subject to the Jews. What it really should be is, if we're equal, we should be equal to the same obligations for all the rights that they had. I mean, anyway, doesn't make sense, but since the Gentiles were now equal in the sight of God, this restriction was no longer necessary. Wow, we've grown up. We don't need this protection that Jesus and the apostles all think are necessary. Jewish Christians even preferred idol meat. Oh my gosh, so they were looking for this stuff, since it was usually less expensive in the marketplace. My goodness. Paul stipulates another reason why idol meat is permitted. As concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. 1 Corinthians 8:4-6. So we'll get into it, and you'll see if this is reasonable or not. Well, you can eat all the idol meat you want. Jesus said it flat. You couldn't. James said you flat couldn't. He didn't say there was any extenuating circumstances or situations you could eat it. You don't eat it. That's all the command was. And it's like, you have to wonder, if you say it 5 times with no exception, no qualifications, nothing. You have the example of Daniel, that he wouldn't eat it at all. He wouldn't even get close to the meat. It wasn't a matter of participating in a worship service or anything like that. You just don't eat it. That's what Daniel gave us as an example. Did I say David? I mean Daniel. So that's something you'll have to struggle with, each one of you, as you go through this. But this is a learning process. But again, I'm not the one who can. Anybody can see this. Anybody, when you go to these passages, can see it plain as day. Okay, so just a little preview for next time. We're going to study Paul's claims in 1 Corinthians 8:4-13 and 1 Corinthians 10 verses 9-19, and maybe a little bit of commentary on Romans 14:1-3 on the permissibility of eating meat sacrificed to idols. And you decide, is Jesus and Paul contradicting? Is Paul allowing something that Jesus prohibits? Is Paul allowing something that the 12 apostles in joint conference with Paul present, listening and knowing what the rule was? Did he have a right to countermand Jesus and the 12 apostles? And if he's doing that, could he really be a true apostle of Jesus Christ, the same person who's telling us it's wrong? So this is all to be weighed in the big picture of when you open up your Bible, you take a responsibility every time you open it to the pages of Paul now. Is that somebody you want to be listening to? Or how about look at James, Jude, Peter? I don't mind Peter. And most importantly of all, who do you think? All right, God bless everybody. Ciao.